right, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the afternoon sessions of our Age of Reagan conference. My name is Andy Rudalevich. I'm a professor of government at Bowdoin College up in Maine. It was worth the trip to come and to be able to have the chance to hear some of the great scholarship being presented at this conference generally and at this panel in particular. It's really neat to see what kind of work is being done on the administrative presidency by these terrific young scholars, well, younger than me anyway, and of course these days that's an increasingly easy target to meet, but nonetheless, these are folks who are doing some really interesting, innovative work. Now, these are, I should warn you all, political scientists. There will be charts and slides and maybe even some empirical data. So that's exciting. I should also probably warn you in the spirit of avoiding false advertising that none of them are technically about Ronald Reagan, these papers, but they are all very much within the purview of the age of Reagan. Of course, those of you may be familiar with Dick Nathan's book, written in a couple of different iterations, one called The Plot That Failed, which was about the Nixon administration and its efforts to impose control over a bureaucracy that it thought, with some justification, was not particularly sympathetic to its preferences. Nathan came back with a sequel. It's actually the best kind of academic book because he took his old book and then added to it and got two book publications out of it. But nonetheless, the second book was called The Administrative Presidency, published in 1983, and really goes into the mechanisms by which presidents to this day have sought to assert more control than they have under the pure text of the Constitution with regards to executive branch behavior. So we could argue that under President Reagan, the plot at least thickened. Maybe it succeeded. I think certainly presidents over time have tried to move from the plot that failed to the plot that succeeded, and we'll get some sense of their success rate in that regard. So I will get out of your way. I'm going to go in the order of the program, and each of the presenters will have about 12 minutes to share their work with you. That should give us some time for comments, and then I hope for some robust discussion from the audience. So we're going to start out with Nathan Gibson. Nathan is well known, of course, to the Reagan Institute folks here. He's been a postdoctoral fellow with the Institute, and glad to say he is also now a full-time employee in academe. He'll be starting, or I guess technically has started already, at Elizabethtown College in beautiful central Pennsylvania. Nathan's going to be talking about centralization and accountability.
All right, thanks, Andy. Thanks for chairing this panel. Thanks to all of you for being here. So yes, I want us to jump straight in to March 1982. And this is what President Reagan's approval rating looked like at that time. It was straight downhill. And we know, of course, the story changes, but in Strategic Evaluation Memorandum number 13 from March 82 by Dr. Richard Beale, he goes very in-depth into all these different public opinion and public relation problems that the president was facing at that time. And he concludes with, therefore, the president should contemplate some bold and sustained action to redirect the current line of thinking. In other words, he's basically suggesting the president needs to engage in centralized policymaking in order to improve presidential approval. And so this leads to some questions. Do presidents actually do that? Do they do centralized policymaking to change their political standing? And if they do that, what political factors might affect this centralization decision? Because the prior literature has pretty much, not exclusively, but we mostly have focused on the more administrative aspects of centralization. How does this affect presidential management of the executive branch? But as some other people on this panel will point out, it's not just the administrative aspect, but there's a political aspect as well. There has been some work now on executive orders and accountability, but not really centralization itself and the kind of these political factors and public accountability. And as Andy's work has pointed out, executive orders are not centralization necessarily. And so even though there's been quite a bit of work looking at executive orders and accountability, that's not necessarily going to be reflective in the president's more broad centralization decision. Why might presidents engage in centralization to help their political standing? These are a few ideas. This is a new project. I'm welcome to hear more ideas you all might have. One is that they can use centralized policymaking to change or set the national agenda. They can also use centralized policymaking to signal. They might be signaling perhaps to the other branches, something like policymaking skill, or they could be signaling to their base, something like effort, that they're really working hard, even if they can't actually get something passed through Congress, for example. It could assist in credit claiming. When they're running for re-election, they can say, you should give responsibility for this good economy to me because I pushed through these policies, for example. And it could also perhaps be used for pandering, policies that have perhaps some short-term electoral benefit, but long-term may or may not be wise policies. And a more modern example could be the Biden student loan forgiveness plans, which I think you could apply almost any of those reasons I just listed to that plan. So I think presidents are still doing this today, not just in 1982. So from this, I come up with a few hypotheses to test. No formal model here, but for example, let's think about centralization and public priorities first. So if the public cares a lot about an issue, we might expect, for the reasons I just mentioned above, that presidents would want to centralize policymaking and create a policy in that area if the public really cares about it. The president might care even more about these policy areas if it's a doorstep issue. So a doorstep issue you can think of as basically those basic issues that the public can understand more easily. For example, minimum wage is really easy for the public to grasp a change in minimum wage and vote accordingly, where a non-doorstep issue, they may or may not care that much about certain types of foreign relations or regulations of nuclear energy or things like that. The relationship between popularity and centralization is a little less clear from the prior literature. If popularity means that the president has other options now besides centralization, then we might expect that the president engages in lower levels of centralization as become more popular. Maybe then they can go to Congress, and Congress can't say no because this is a super popular president, and so the president doesn't have to centralize. Or if popularity means fewer constraints, people are less willing to constrain the president. And there's even evidence in the literature that Supreme Courts are more deferential, for example, to popular presidents. Then popularity could mean that the president engages in more centralization. We might also think that if it's an election year and the president's looking for something to campaign on, they might be more likely to engage in centralization leading up to an election. But they could also be afraid of policies going bad or failing. If you really push for a policy and it just doesn't pass, that's not going to look great during an election year. And so alternatively, you might imagine that presidents are less likely to engage in centralization leading up to an election. Or at the margins, perhaps if the president's right around 50%, they might be extra willing to take that risk to do some sort of policy, especially perhaps in an election year, to try to get that temporary bump over 50%. So that's some of the general things we'll be testing today. And the data I'm going to use will be based off of centralization data that Andy Ruderlevich actually started, and I'm continuing into the 21st century. And it covers policies at this point from 1957 to 2000, and I'm in the process of extending that through the Bush administration, though it gets more dicey as things get more modern, because this is an archival measure of centralization where we essentially randomly select policies from presidents' legislative agendas, and then you study what Andy calls the prehistory of these policies and how much that happens inside the executive office of the president or elsewhere. And then you can rate this on a scale of, we do basically a 4-point scale of less centralized to more centralized. I'm happy to answer any questions about this. Feel free to interrupt. I then match these data with most important problem from Gallup. So the Policy Agendas Project has assigned Gallup has asked throughout this time period, what's the most important problem facing America? And then Policy Agendas Project has then categorized those into about 20 different policy areas. And then I have categorized these centralized policies into the same 20 policy areas. And so now we can see whether the public thinks that these policy areas are important or not for each of the centralized policies. And I've also categorized them according to doorstep issues or non-doorstep issues. We also have presidential approval, election year, and a variety of control variables that we know affect typically the more managerial side of centralization based on Andy's and my prior research on these topics. So first, this is the top line of the regression, looking at whether presidents centralize public priorities. So if the public says it's more of a priority, does the president then centralize that more? So the first column shows that overall, this is not the case. But in the second column, you can see that this is the case for doorstep issues. So let's look here. It's a little more intuitive. These are predicted probabilities. So the red line there is the highest level of centralization. So, and then the x-axis is the most important problem rating by the public, which means that as you go further towards 80%, that means the public considers this more of a priority. More of the public considers that. And so we see as the public considers it more of a priority, there's a greater probability that that policy is going to be highly centralized. So this is for doorstep issues only. If we go to non-doorstep issues, we don't see any such trend there. So that's something interesting. When I look at just the overall presidential approval distance from 50% for pandering, or election year, or because this is the president's legislative agenda, congressional election year, we actually don't see any relationship here. So it seems like maybe the political factors are not playing a huge impact on the president's centralization decision. But we might also want to look at whether election year impacts the president's decision here. And so again, this is not very intuitive, so let's look at the predicted probabilities. I'll explain this. I know this is a lot of charts here, but basically what we're going to look at is during election and non-election years, do presidents centralize differently? So on the left side, it's non-election years. On the right side, it's election years. And yes, there's not as much data in election years, of course. So especially for this one, we can't really draw conclusions because these standard errors, the shaded area, are too large. But we can see some general trends. And so this is for doorstep issues. And lower down is the probability of a low ranking of centralization. Higher up on the graphs is a probability of high levels of centralization. So what we can see here on the left side is that during non-election years, presidents engage in more centralization of doorstep issues as it becomes a public priority. So that's the same finding that I discussed just a minute ago. But in election years, there's no such trend there. And in fact, when we look at non-doorstep issues, we see the opposite trend. So we see that during an election year on non-doorstep issues, the president's less likely to centralize those. So in election years, the president, there could be different interpretations, but it seems like they want to perhaps act on these issues as they become more important to the public. And so you might expect that they would then do more centralization, but since this is centralization of the president's legislative agenda, it probably would take too long to actually create a policy, get it passed through Congress, be able to campaign on it. And so as an issue becomes more publicly important, the president's actually not centralizing that into their legislative agenda. Perhaps they're pursuing a different avenue of influence. Here we have the relationship between presidential approval and centralization and election and non-election years. So in non-election years, there's no relationship. And then in election years, this is not a statistically significant difference, but we do see that policies seem to get less centralized in election years, the more popular a president is. And then what's perhaps more interesting is this is not quite statistically significant, but it's getting close, is that when we look at distance from 50% in popularity, there's a negative relationship. So especially if you just look at the top two panels here, and in a non-election year, there's no relationship between the distance that presidential popularity is from 50% and whether the president centralizes that policy. But in an election year, as the distance from 50% increases, that probability goes down, which means that there is some at least suggestive evidence that when presidential popularity is marginal, they are more likely to centralize policymaking. So I know all of that is fairly confusing, but a few major takeaways for you all is that presidents do tend to centralize issues when the public thinks that they are more important, but only for doorstep issues. So if the public thinks the issue is important and it's an easy to understand issue, then the president is more likely to centralize that, taking into account all of the managerial factors that we know about centralization. However, presidential approval and election years or other such factors in of themselves don't really seem to be related to centralization. But presidents do seem to act at least somewhat differently in election years and non-election years. And then one way that they do that is that there is a statistically significant relationship that presidents are less likely to centralize publicly important non-doorstep issues. So those issues that the public thinks are important, yet is also hard for the public to understand, the president's not going to centralize those in election years, probably pursuing other policy mechanisms. And obviously more work needs to be done on this project, but also just on this topic in general, thinking about what are the non-managerial factors that are affecting these decisions for presidential policymaking. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I look forward to your comments on how to improve this project.
Great. So our next paper is coming from Annie Ben. Annie's a graduate student wrapping up her degree at UC Berkeley. She's on the market, so if any of you have hiring power, this is going to be a very good introduction to why you should hire her. This paper is on the complementarity of political appointments and regulatory review, and I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize former Administrator Graham, head of OIRA in the Reagan administration. So very relevant topic to regulatory review. Annie?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Nathan, for organizing this great panel. Yes, I'm Annie Ben. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Berkeley. I'm not sure which of these I'm supposed to talk into. And today I'm presenting some new work on complementarities between some different tools of presidential management of the bureaucracy. So the big major question that I'm interested in with this project is how can the president control the bureaucracy? And obviously there's an enormous literature in political science on this question. The bureaucracy is huge, issues a lot of different policies, many of which are very consequential for people's lives. So the president wants to make sure that whatever it is the bureaucracy is doing is in line with that administration's priorities and preferences. And how can he do that? For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on two tools of presidential control that were sort of crystallized or institutionalized during the Reagan administration. So the first is regulatory review, which is a form of post hoc oversight of agency regulatory action. So agencies, when they issue new rules or regulations, they have to follow procedures set out in the Administrative Procedure Act, which is an act of Congress from 1946. And a few presidents played around with centralized regulatory review, but it was institutionalized by President Reagan in 1981 with Executive Order 12291, which requires agencies before finalizing a rule to submit the rule to OIRA, which is an agency in OMB, to kind of take one last look at it and make sure that it's both harmonized with other agency rules. So if you have two agencies working in the same area, you want to make sure they're not issuing contradictory regulations, but also to make sure the agency rules are consonant with administrative priorities. And so we typically think of OIRA review as a tool that presidents have to make sure that rules coming out of the administrative state are consistent with their policy objectives. An interesting finding in the political science literature is that ideological misalignment between agencies and presidents is not predictive of OIRA determinations. So you would think, for example, that OIRA would change more rules from more liberal agencies under Republican administrations and from more conservative agencies under Democratic administrations, and that doesn't seem to be the case. And so this finding was originally found by Simon Hayter and Susan Webb-Yackey, and I read that paper and kind of thought, well, that can't be true, and so I wrote another paper to try and show how it wasn't true, and inadvertently corroborated their findings. So I'm pretty convinced at this point now that ideological misalignment does not predict OIRA determinations. And what I found when I was looking into this is that actually OIRA changes more rules under Democratic presidents than under Republican presidents, even controlling for agency ideology and controlling for a number of other factors, which was counterintuitive to me. I would have expected that the Republican presidents would be exercising sort of more of this post hoc oversight. So I was trying to think through, okay, well, what might explain that? And what I came up with, which I'm kind of starting to explore with this project, is that if Democrats and Republicans are using post hoc oversight differently, maybe it's because they're also using ex-ante tools of influence differently as well. And so that's where I bring in this idea of politicization, which in political science has a very specific definition, which is the use of politically motivated appointments of personnel into the bureaucracy. And that's not only Senate-confirmed appointees, but also these various other types of appointees, senior executive service and Schedule C, where the president has a lot of flexibility over how many appointees to put in different agencies and where in the agency hierarchy to locate them. And there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of literature on both of these tools separately, but in the politicization literature in particular, there's this idea of responsive competence, which is a term kind of, I don't know if coined, but at least popularized by Terry Moe in 1985, in response to what was seen at the time as a sort of normatively bad tendency of the Reagan administration to put loyalists into the bureaucracy. There was this idea that, like, no, you should let the bureaucracy just be neutral experts. And what Terry Moe was arguing is that that's not what the president wants. The president doesn't want neutral experts. He wants experts that are going to be responsive to his political priorities. And so politicization through appointments is a tool that the president has to shape agency activity to make sure that what they're doing is sort of driving the bus in the right direction that the president wants as their priority. So that's sort of the question that this paper is asking then is, how do these tools operate in combination? So there's a lot of literature in political science on how these tools operate separately, how presidents make choices about politicization, how presidents make choices, or how OIRA makes choices about rules. But we haven't really looked at how they operate in combination. And presidents don't make these decisions in a vacuum. They have comprehensive strategies of how they're going to manage the administrative state. So what I'm exploring with this paper is, how do these tools operate collectively? And what I'm going to try and convince you of is that they are strategic substitutes for one another. The president has sort of an attention budget constraint. He can't be everywhere at once. He can't appoint infinity appointees. He also can't look closely at every single rule that comes into OIRA. And so because of that constraint, presidents are going to try and optimize sort of just the right amount of politicization, just the right amount of regulatory review in combination. And it sort of makes sense that these would move in opposite directions, because if you think about an agency that's trying to promulgate a rule, if that agency has a lot of loyalists in it already, sort of directing how that rule is going to be developed, it's more likely that OIRA is going to find that rule unobjectionable because sort of co-ideologues were involved in its creation. On the other hand, if you have an agency that doesn't have a lot of political appointees, then OIRA is going to want to take a harder look at the rules that come out of that agency, just double check that we're all kind of on the same page. So that's my hypothesis, is that they're substitutes. And in fact, I argue that this relationship, this inverse relationship between politicization and regulatory review is going to be stronger for agencies that issue more rules. So if there's an agency that's issuing one rule in a year, that agency is probably not acting in a presidential priority policy area. It's not going to be where the president is spending most of his attention on control. So we might not see this relationship as strongly. But for the agencies that are issuing many rules in a year, those agencies are doing a lot of policy changes, and that's where the president, it's going to be worth his while to kind of spend the effort and make sure that he's using these tools as efficiently as possible. Okay, so now to the data part. The data for this project comes from a number of different sources. So for appointments data, I have some information from OPM. They have a website called FedScope where you can download appointments data. But they don't have the Senate-confirmed positions on that database. But some work by Dave Lewis from 2008 has a data set of the Senate-confirmed positions as well as these other types of appointees, but it's a narrower date range. So those are the two appointments data sources. And then OIRA publishes regulatory review data on reginfo.gov. So I have the total number, and I'm focusing on final rules, not proposed rules. So the total number of final rules submitted by agencies to OIRA, and the number of those rules for which OIRA requested changes. So in the end, I have a data set ranging from 1994 to 2019 with 791 agency year observations for the FedScope data and 401 for the Lewis data. And the data does go back into the Reagan administration. The motivation for the 1994 start date is that there was an executive order issued under the Clinton administration that sort of changed the scope of what rules need to be submitted to OIRA for review. And so the data before and after 1994 it's not comparable, which is why I've chosen this cutoff. All right, and so then the analysis I'm going to do, the dependent variable, what I'm trying to predict is the proportion of rules submitted by an agency in a year for which OIRA requests changes. The explanatory variables then are politicization. I have two different measures that I'm going to use. One is just the total number of appointees in the agency. The other is an appointee ratio, so the number of appointees over the number of employees in the agency. And then I'm interacting that with the total rules submitted by the agency to OIRA. And so what that interaction does is it allows me to estimate a different relationship between politicization and rule changes, depending on how many rules the agency issues. And then I include some controls. And before I turn to the results, I just want to show you that the number of submitted rules, this data is heavily right skewed. So the majority of agencies are submitting one or maybe two rules in a year. But then there's this long tail into 10, 20, 30 rules. And I think those agencies that are submitting 10, 20, 30 rules in a year, those are the agencies where we're going to see any sort of relationship between politicization and rulemaking. Both because I think theoretically that's where the president's going to be paying attention, but also just sort of mathematically, if you're calculating a proportion out of one, it's either 0 or 1. And so it's really hard to get like a nice, estimate of the effect size. So it's very noisy if you're just looking at the ones. But anyway, all right. And so this is what I find. So this table or this chart here, the x-axis is the appointee measure. In the left column, the measure is the appointee ratio. In the right column, the measure is the number of appointees. And then the y-axis is the predicted proportion changed. The top row is using the FedScope data. The bottom row is using the Lewis data. So all 4 of these panels are exactly the same thing, just a different measure of politicization and a different data set for the appointee data. What they all show is that for agencies issuing 1 rule per year, which is the red line, we see either a flat relationship or maybe an increasing relationship, but not a statistically significant one. So this is, so for agencies issuing 1 rule per year, I'm not finding the relationship that I hypothesized. But as you move to more rules per year, the agency submitting 5 and then 10 rules per year, you see exactly the relationship I expected, which is that when you have agencies with more appointees, those agencies' rules are less likely to receive changes by OIRA. So just to conclude, I found what I said. Agencies with a higher ratio of political appointees or with more appointees have fewer rules changed by OIRA. The relationship is only present for the agencies that I'm calling higher impact agencies, again, by which I mean issuing many rules. For future work, I have some additional data. I actually requested some additional data from OPM that arrived in my email like the day after I submitted this paper to the conference. So next draft will have some more data. Variation over time, how that might have evolved as the regulatory state changes. But what I'm really interested in again, is this variation by party. And does the relationship between politicization and regulatory review, is it different for Democrat and Republican presidents? So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
Wonderful, thank you. Our third paper is from Scott Limbacher and Lee Robinson. Scott is here today. Both are scholars at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And in keeping with that, I suppose, though Scott has written about a lot of things that are non-defense related, this is about accountability through capacity. And you're going to learn a lot about how the chain of command works at the Pentagon. Scott, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, and Nathan, thanks for organizing a great panel and inviting us out here. It's been a real pleasure to be a part of this conference, and I'm grateful to get to present this work that I'm working on with Lee. Despite the haircut, I am a civilian through and through. I am not military at all. Lee is, though. He's an aviation officer. He's also the program director for the American Politics program at West Point. We both study public sector personnel, and so in living through the DoD, we're like, well, we should look at the organization we're a part of through a lens of public sector personnel management. And so that's what we're going to bring to this. Before I get going, I want to make the disclaimer clear. This is academic research from Lee and myself. This is not the view of our employer at any level. So this is not the official stance of the West Point, Department of the Army, DoD, et cetera, et cetera. And so to begin, I thankfully have Nathan and Annie framing this question quite well with the research. So I'm going to go through it in basically 2 bullet points on presidential control, and that all presidents face this problem of needing to implement their policy agenda through an agency that they don't necessarily have the authority over compelling people to participate in. And so this leaves them with personnel to be there to assert what the policy preferences of the president are to the various agencies. The DoD is not any different in that regard. Where the DoD is different is that there's this norm of civ-mil relations that have been present throughout this. And so if we even think back to George Washington and the Newburgh Conspiracy, there's a deference component where the military is going to follow the rules and the policy preferences that are put up by, they say civilians, but really it's elected officials. It's the elected officers so that democratic accountability is present throughout the military. And the military is going to go about and enact the policy that the elected officials give it, whether it be the president or Congress. They're there to implement policy choices. Yes, they provide feedback, but when the order comes down, they follow the order. And this applies a dichotomy. So you can either think of it as a principal-agent problem or a civ mil problem, but the president's going to tell agency personnel what to do, and they should go do it. And the military is going to do what's asked of it. Yet, we know that's not necessarily what happens. And there are lots of people that are in a spectrum of positions that are not clearly within a dichotomy. And so just to point out a few, a GS-15, a top civilian employee in the DoD. They're not military, they don't wear the uniform. They're hired by merit principles. They're not responsive to the president. They can't be fired for they can't be fired for just the policy preferences being in disagreement with the administration. Where do they fit in this problem within this civ-mil dynamic? General officers go through Senate confirmations. That's quite salient right now on whether or not slates get approved. And so we have these merit professionals that work through an organization for many decades ultimately go up for a Senate vote on whether or not they can take the job. It's also the case that presidents can relieve them of their duty. And so if that's the case, that doesn't really look like the merit protection that many civil servants enjoy. And there are appointees within the organization that don't go through a Senate confirmation, that do serve more directly with the president. I'm going to talk about those a little more. So really, instead of a dichotomy, DoD ends up looking something more like this. And this is a gross oversimplification, even with it being a colorful spider web. You have Article 1 authority in Congress, Article 2 authority from the president. Those blur together through a Senate confirmation for the PAS folks. There's also non-career SES, which are unilateral appointments to about half of the SES jobs are available to potentially be non-career SES, which means they don't have to go through a merit hiring process. There's also Schedule C employees. Schedule C employees are unilateral appointments by the president to help enact the president's policy within the agency. And even within that, now there's general officers. I'll talk about the senior executive service that gets created in 1978 as well. Interesting note there, many of the paperwork that I have to go get signed for some of the things that I like to do with research either require a GO or SES signature. So within the organization structure, civilian SES are treated like general officers in many instances. And so where does that fit within a civ-mil dynamic? And so we have this relationship of a president now trying to enact policy over an organization. I don't have numbers next to the bubbles, but there's roughly, depending on how you want to count Guard and reservists, 2 to 3 million people in the brown and green bubbles, and then another about 700,000 people in the black bubbles that they're trying to enact policy through. That's a lot. And within the appointed officials, there's a few hundred of them that are basically wrangling a sea of several million. Okay. And so the Reagan era provides a pretty interesting gateway into how presidents might be able to manage this. First, the Civil Service Reform Act was passed in 1978, so the implementation of it, the reorganization of the civilian side of agency life, not just within DoD, but across all of government, happens. In particular, the senior executive service is a new class of civil servant that enables, or basically positions now presidents with a different entity to now try to control. The SES was designed to be continuity between administrations. These are sitting above the general schedule, and the idea is they can translate policy positions of the administration to the rank and file members in the agencies so that the mission of the agency can meet the intention of the administration. And so this presents a first hypothesis that now that there is this elite cadre of managers that are new on the scene, the unilateral appointments, so the non-career SES or the Schedule C, there should be more of those following the creation of the career SES because there's a greater need for unilateral implementation of this policy. And then Goldwater-Nichols occurs. So this is largely a military restructure. This is a reworking to try and make it to where the military jointness works better. There was a disconnect between the jointness of this. And so what it ultimately did is it put more control in the military's hands. And so if we think about this from a dynamic of trying to enact policy, presidents now should have to try and rein back control from the military, which through this reorganization got more authority. And so what we would expect to see here is, following Goldwater-Nichols, personnel being moved into the office of the secretary and out of the service components. And so the service components are the Department of the Army, Navy, Air Force. And so instead of having authority down in the service components, if the president is trying to gain control of the Department of Defense, they should put more personnel in the office of the secretary. Okay, so the data that I have to talk about and show this. The Enterprise Human Resource Integration data set, this is basically OPM's accounting of everyone in government. And BuzzFeed News somehow got through a FOIA request that no academic could successfully get through for well over a decade and got all the records. So they have a quarterly snapshot of government from 1974 to 2017. It's like roughly 30 gigs of data. Importantly, though, for what I'm going to talk about, I can see the appointment authorities of all the PAS folks. They have a pay band that's unique to their own that lets me identify them. Schedule Cs, non-career SES, and career SES all have appointment authorities that are unique to those positions. So they're outside of the merit hiring process. And it lets me actually see who's basically sitting in what seat. And then the agency codes, there's a little under 200 agency codes, but importantly, I can see who's in the office of the secretary or who's in the different service components as well. Okay, and so we're gonna look from 1980 on to 2017 where we can, 2014 when I'm tracking individuals, because I lose a pseudo identification tracker number in 2014. So this first chart is just a count of how many of each type there are. And the line that is way above all the others are the career SES. And you can see a spike in hiring because they weren't there previously. Now they're here and they have to get hired across time. And so we see this sort of hiring occur. In the Clinton administration, there are more of the Schedule Cs and non-career SES than in earlier administrations. I'm going to show you charts with panels so where you don't have to squint and try to guess at where they are on the scale. This is mostly just to point out that there are way more career SES than there are appointed officials. So what about Reagan? Well, here's what happened during his administration across the employment types. So the upper left panel is the Senate-confirmed PAS folks. The Schedule Cs are in the upper right panel. The non-career SES are the ones in the left bottom panel, and then in the right bottom panel, those are the career members of the SES. I'm not going to make this into a statistical Rorschach test where you try to find patterns in here. There really isn't a whole lot going on within the Reagan administration other than they are hiring people within this. There could maybe be an inkling in the career SES where you see more of OSD being career SES, but that's a pattern that is sort of happening outside of Goldwater-Nichols going through, which is the vertical bar in the charts. But there's other presidencies that I can look at to see if things are moving within this as well. And to preview two results I'm going to show you here, we do see centralization in OSD following Goldwater-Nichols, especially with the Clinton administration. And Schedule C is starting to get used a lot more in the Clinton administration as well. And potentially this is a response to more career SES that are having to be managed. I don't have any sort of qualitative evidence to support that, but they move in conjunction with one another. And so this chart is looking essentially at the different appointment types either in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or the Office of the Secretary. So for the Senate confirmed folks, that's the upper left panel. It's the pattern that you would think for that, as well as the non-career SES in the panel below of essentially these people leave when the administration turns over. They serve the administration that brought them on. When the new one comes in, they leave. The peaks are actually understating it because in the process of leaving, some people hang on to continue for policy continuity until the new person can either get confirmed or move in. When I show you here in a second the chart of basically who hired or when did they begin this time period, you'll see the peaks are actually more pronounced. The last panel, though, is the career SES, and there is actually a centralization story that's happening here. The line at the top, post-Clinton administration, those are all in OSD. So you can see over the 80s and the early 90s, a movement into OSD. It's also the case that all of the appointed types, the line on top, those are in OSD as well. And so these are positions, especially for non-career SES and Schedule Cs, that the president has discretion over, has the ability to place them, and the president is choosing to place them in the Office of the Secretary, which sits atop the service components and gives greater authority for the presidency to work through it. Okay, so the legacy of the administrations in DoD. What I have here is essentially, I'm counting where you started. It's a count of who hired you, if you want to think of it as a hiring process. It's truly a hiring in the case of the appointees. For the career SES, it's a merit hire through DoD. But this is basically a count of when did you start working in one of these jobs across time. And what you can see is for the appointed officials, basically when an election comes and a new administration enters, they all leave. There's very, very few people that make it past the transition, except for maybe perhaps the appointed officials in the Obama administration. There are more legacy types from the Clinton era and the George W. Bush era. It could be a reflection of policy continuity through the war on terror that was wanting to be maintained, but those individuals are staying. But by and large, especially when you look at the non-career SES or the Schedule Cs, they basically go away outside of a hang-on of HW or Schedule Cs. This contrasts with the career SES, which you see a perpetual hiring over the course of the administrations and then basically a long tail of people staying on. Well, these are merit hires that are designed to have continuity in government. These are people that are supposed to be staying, and it brings then an interesting question. The half-life on any one of these administrations is about 10 years. So about half of the people that are in a career SES position that begin in one administration, to reduce the number in half is basically a decade, meaning that any new administration that wants to have its policy communicated through the career SES down to the rank and file will be doing so with people that began and worked closely with the previous administration. It's not as though they're political appointees that are loyal to that administration, but there's policy continuity that they're going to have to adjust with. And so what do? We argue essentially that you can see the Schedule C appointments come into proliferation basically the first time that there is a pivot from a Republican administration that hired the career SES. So after the H.W. Bush administration, we see a need for the Clinton administration to deal with 12 years of hiring or having Reagan career SES and H.W. career SES enacting policy. And so we think this is some evidence that appointments are essentially being used to gain control over the agency. All right, so to sum up what I've shown you today, we do find evidence of personnel being used to gain control over the Department of Defense, either through centralization and OSD following Goldwater-Nichols, and also the case that there are more unilateral appointments made following the creation of the Senior Executive Service. And so the Reagan legacy of personnel, this is probably true beyond the DoD, even though the data I'm showing you today is just the Department of Defense. There are people that began in those jobs, those very important SES positions, that stayed on for many, many years following the Reagan administration. So the next steps, we're going to buttress sort of the anonymized version of this, where I've basically counted position types. All the names are literally redacted in my data, so I can't tell you a single person's name that's in here outside of matching pay bands to people that held certain positions. We want to see basically if what we're observing in the data were material strategies of the administration. And so we're going to investigate that going forward next. And so thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
And then our final presentation comes from Kenny Lawande. Kenny is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Now this version, this is yet a different title than the one I had. I was going to say the first time I saw this research, it was called Presidents as Nihilists, which I still kind of like. I can understand why you changed it, but it had its...
For this audience.
Yeah, there you go.
We're at a different library.
In any case, Kenny, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for being here, and I want to especially thank Nathan for organizing this panel and including me in it, and Andy for bearing with me on this project. He's seen a couple of different iterations. That was a punchline of a joke. You guys just didn't see it. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to try to do something a little hard here. So we're all political scientists. This is not going to include any tables or figures or anything, but I would say that we are trained to think of presidents as just mere data points, right, with nothing really unique about them. So I'm very much going to try to fight that urge in this presentation and do my best. And I'm also going to do my best to focus on the age of Reagan. But we are going to start in the present. And to make my argument here, to explain the developments in the presidential branch that we've seen in the last 30 years or so, I'm going to start with a contemporary case. So back in 2017, right at the beginning of the Trump administration, they moved an initiative that had been housed in the Department of Education on historically black colleges and universities into the White House, physically actually into the Eisenhower building. And normally that would be kind of like a minor administrative minutia kind of move, but they actually made quite a show of it. They invited over 100 college presidents to the White House. They signed an executive order They spent a lot of money, they hired some personnel, and they tried to keep it in the news as much as possible. And the basic research question that this chapter and now working paper for this conference considers is, well, why do presidents do this kind of thing, right? What determines their strategy, right? Why do they make the organizational choices that they do? And what part of their utility function, to sort of use the economist term, is being served, okay? And because my time is short, I'm going to give like the Cliff Notes version of this as much as I can, and so that we can get to discussion. I'm basically going to give 3 answers, 2 of which you've actually probably heard better version and more extensive versions of already from my co-panelists. The first is good governance, which is this kind of classic public administration story. The second is responsive governance, which is the standard sort of responsive competence, very much in vogue in political science. And the third is one that I hope will be in vogue maybe 20 years from now, which is the argument that I'm trying to make in this book, is that some of these moves are used for what I'll call symbolic governance. And I'm going to define all of these in a moment. So first, let's back up and go to this sort of standard good government move. So what does this say? What do presidents need out of their presidential branch, right? What do they need out of the White House and the EOP? Well, they need competent experts, right? They need people who know how to make this place run, people who know how to perform the routine administrative functions that they need. They need help. And importantly, this is usually termed or talked about in terms of neutral competence, right? It's people, it's apolitical in some sense. Now, there's a lot of examples of this in the 20th century that I could point to where presidents are trying to make the White House and EOP function more efficiently. But I think the best line, and my favorite line, actually comes from the origins of OMB. So this is the first director of the Bureau of the Budget, Charles Dawes, and he wrote in his first message to Congress, "We have nothing to do with policy as much as we love the president. If Congress passed a law that garbage should be put on the White House steps, it would be our regrettable duty to advise them as to how the largest amount of garbage could be spread in the most expeditious and economical manner." Okay, right? So neutral, competence, apolitical, they are not supposed to be servants of the president, right? Of course, it's completely unimaginable that contemporary OMB directors would say something like that, right? Mick Mulvaney would instead advise the president as how the funds could be reprogrammed so that the garbage could be put on the Capitol steps instead, right? Which brings us to the second explanation, or potential explanation for why presidents make these moves, which we could term responsive governance, which Annie talked about is sort of very much in vogue after Terry Moe wrote that seminal article in 1985. And it basically says, well, presidents actually need tools to influence the selection and implementation of policy, right? So if we look at administrative or organizational changes in the presidential branch, that explanation gets us pretty far, right? What they're trying to do is bring that institution into congruence, and to use Moe's terms, with their political incentives, right? They're trying to hire people who share their preferences and will work towards this shared vision, which, by the way, voters were put them in place to do, right? So this is where we get to the age of Reagan, because if you talk to or read the political scientists' literature on this today, this is what the Reagan administration gets a lot of credit for, right? A lot of these administrative moves will be familiar to people. I see people in the audience and out, and I've seen them walking around who have been part of the more innovative moves that have brought responsive competence to the White House, right? So regulatory review, which Annie talked about, and also developments in OMB, which I think are best summarized by a line from Matt Dickinson, where he talks about how OMB moved from privately advising the president to serving as a presidential spokesperson, right? And now, so it makes sense. We don't get Charles Dawes anymore. We get people more like Mick Mulvaney. So all of this has been reviewed so far. And I think it's relatively conventional to think in these terms. And a lot of what presidents do today to reorganize the White House org chart and to hire people can be explained in those terms. But I think in other cases, not so much, right? And so I want to put forward a third potential argument, which is that sometimes these moves are not so much about controlling the bureaucracy or about making the trains run on time, but they're also about symbolic governance. They're about performing in front of an audience and making it clear that the president cares about particular priorities. Okay? And to go back to this case, in particular, I think it's very difficult to imagine either one of these explanations explains why you would take an initiative that had been housed there in the Department of Education, going back to, actually, the initiative goes back to Carter, and it's been continued by every president since then, why you would do that. Right, so from a good governance standpoint, typically when you give some new initiative real estate within the White House org chart, you set up an office, and it's dedicated to some sort of, or some new purpose like climate change or like AIDS policy or something. The argument that people tend to make is that they're performing a coordination function, right? That there's a lot of different agencies who are, have a shared mission, but their efforts are not properly coordinated. Moving the initiative from the Department of Education into the White House actually created a coordination problem because they had to communicate with the people who were still working in the Ed department because they were now across town, essentially. So from a good governance standpoint, it didn't make very much sense. Also didn't make that much sense from a responsiveness standpoint. This was never a rogue agency or a rogue initiative. It was always called the White House Initiative. It just happened to be housed somewhere else. And also, when they moved it into the White House, they severely understaffed it, and they also didn't give it any new coercive power, right? So even the director of the initiative, which was later hired, later admitted publicly that they had no, that they were all carrot. They never, or they didn't have any ability to make anybody do anything. But from a symbolic government standpoint, this makes actually a lot of sense, I think, okay? So let me define what I mean by that. Basically, I think presidents sometimes need the tools to create the impression that they're getting things done. And this sounds initially like sort of deception, but that's really not what I mean here. I think that voters and interest groups, to some extent, have a serious problem when they're trying to judge whether a president is doing a good job, okay, right? They need to know whether the president shares their priorities, but on the other hand, they can't independently verify anything that the president's doing, right? They're not reading the unified agenda, right? They can't observe policy implementation. So what they do is they rely on symbols, okay? And my basic argument in this working paper and book chapter, hopefully book chapter eventually, is that the White House, especially since Reagan, has increasingly gotten in the business of creating those symbols, right? It's essentially become a factory that does more of that kind of work. And importantly, this is very distinct from that good government story. It's also distinct from the responsive governance story, and it requires a different kind of expertise, okay? Okay, and yeah, okay, so, again, to put it in the context of the conference that we were talking about here, the Reagan administration is seen as an inflection point for the development of that responsive governance model. And I think, and we were talking about this a little earlier at breakfast, I think most political scientists would agree is that the playbook, or the Reagan administration established a playbook for controlling the bureaucracy and making sure it was doing what the president wanted. And every subsequent president has adopted that playbook and ratcheted up some aspect of it, right? So they were innovative on that dimension. What I would argue is that most of the innovation since then has not necessarily been on that responsive competence dimension, but instead on this other symbolic governance dimension. And so what I want to close with is basically 3 examples that go far beyond the case, one case that I was using to frame this talk, that suggests that the White House is moving more in this symbolic governance dimension. So the first of these is personnel. Okay, so since the Reagan administration in particular, and there were a lot of complaints about this during the Clinton administration, White House staff in particular has tended to be younger and tended to have less experience in government. Okay, now if what you wanted was either good government, right, efficiency, the White House acting in the public interest, or the White House serving the preferences of the president, these are not the kinds of people that you would hire. But if what you wanted to do was to run this sort of perpetual campaign from the White House and the EOP, these are the exact kind of people that you would hire. There's sort of people with campaign experience, people with experience in politics. The other thing, and you could just, if you go through and read, say, the contemporary org charts of the White House, is there's been a proliferation of these, what you might call boutique offices and initiatives that are outside of the normal sort of chain or kind of standard chain of command within the White House, right? So typically they'll have a named constituency, and it's kind of funny when I was going back to do some of the reading of this, if you read the work by, say, Richard Nathan or people who have commented or talked about bringing or making sure that the president can control the bureaucracy from the top down, they will talk about these kinds of initiatives as counterproductive, right? Because what they ultimately do is bring interest groups under the umbrella of the White House and allow them to fight with each other, which ultimately makes presidents get less of what they want. So again, that doesn't make very much sense from a responsive competence story, but if what your goal is to demonstrate your priorities and to service particular constituencies when you might not be able to get them everything that they want right now, this is exactly what you would do. And then the last thing that I'll mention, which I talk a lot more about in my book, is that the timing and scope of executive actions, say executive orders, memoranda, all of the above, has increasingly been influenced by political strategy, and by that I mean mostly the political calendar. We tend to see a lot, or we see political strategy entering into when the president decides to act, right? And not necessarily sort of whether they act, because often, as we know from Andy's work, a lot of this stuff comes from the bureaucracy and not from the White House, but they may put a pause or they may speed up the action that the administration was trying to do. Okay? And all of that, again, has a symbolic dimension. So with that, I'd like to close out, and I'd be looking forward to your comments. So thank you very much for listening.
Great. So thank you to all the panelists, and we're going to have, I think, time for some good discussion. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative just to sort of raise a couple of high-level issues. I do have some smaller things that I'll email the panelists about, but we've got it at 3, right? So we're in pretty good shape here in terms of having time. So one thing I wanted to note sort of generally is we've heard a lot about politicization and centralization. One of my sort of queries paper by paper is that I'm not sure we're always using the same definition of those terms across. There's no reason that we need to have the exact same definition, but it is worth noting Terry Moe's work in 1985 was cited a couple times, and that article was actually a book chapter. So book chapters can matter. The politicized presidency, which was, as Kenny noted, prompted really by the Reagan administration. A lot of people, Hugh Hecklow among others, were criticizing Reagan for politicizing various pieces of the administration. Moe said, yeah, of course he is. That's a good idea. You should do that. Presidents have to do that. It's really their only choice, given, again, how weak they are in the Constitution. A little bit ironic, because Moe's sort of day job at the time was going around criticizing Richard Neustadt for his work, which he argued personalized the presidency far too much. Neustadt argued presidents are weak. They have to find ways to be leaders instead of clerks. But Moe is actually starting from the exact same point. They're coming to different conclusions, but Moe's argument is effectively presidents are weak. They need to figure out how they can be leaders instead of clerks. Terry, as I say, had sort of a role on the presidency scholarship dinner circuit for a while, attacking Neustadt and really actually the entire subfield of presidency studies. I am glad to say that in 2009, he declared victory in an article called revolution in presidency studies, not the myth of triumphalism, but actually straight out triumphalism, actually. But nonetheless, I think perhaps well taken. And it was, as we've seen, this new wave of scholarship on the presidency, I think especially in the kind of exciting side of the administrative presidency, which has some intersection, of course, with public administration and a lot of new work in administrative law. It's a really interesting place for progress, and you're seeing some examples of that here. Kenny's piece is an interesting case in point, right? Because when he's talking about politicization in the paper, I don't think you said it here so much, but you're talking about politicization of the presidential branch. Now, for Terry, right, that was already the politicized part, right? So you didn't, politicization, which is to say putting loyalists out in the wider executive branch so that they would do your will and sort of represent you. There's an anonymous but probably Karl Rove quote from the Bush administration talking about implanting your DNA out in the wider bureaucracy. You either did that or, well, actually the and/or part is a question, as Annie mentioned, but the other possibility was to centralize, which is to bring functions that used to be done out in the wider bureaucracy into something closer to presidential control, i.e. into the presidential branch. So I think I know what Kenny's getting at with regards to this notion of going symbolic. That phrase actually plays on Samuel's idea of going public. But it's a little bit of a weird exception, I think, when you're thinking of politicizing, using that phrase to describe the so-called presidential branch, because that is a little trickier when it comes to how that word is normally used, right? Because it's always been assumed that people within the White House are, in fact, loyal, and responsive, competent. We don't know. More generally, I do think it would be interesting to get a sense, and we've talked about aspects of it, but we really need to see some quantification of White House staff over time. Matt Dickinson, whom he mentioned, does have some work. David Cohen and others who have worked on White House staffing could be helpful just in terms of thinking about getting job titles. Because you make, I think, a plausible point that more people in the White House over time have a role in effectively communications, press, again, representing, a weird form of identity politics, perhaps, and not necessarily in policymaking. And that, I think, would be, again, it would be difficult to maybe at this stage in the process, not in the project's process, not worth it, but would be interesting, I think. The other aspect there, of course, is the sort of burden of proof that these are useless policy councils, right? And I kind of believe it. And you mentioned the example of the historically black colleges and universities council. You talk about the faith-based council more in the wider manuscript. And so I guess I'm willing to believe to some degree that there are indeed staff councils that come in and don't do anything of use, right, that don't have a substantive, may even in fact harm policymaking. But again, would be neat to see that a little more systematically, right? How do the policy, there are lots of these councils. Are some better than others? What makes them better than others? Are they all purely symbolic? I don't quite know. You talk a little bit in the paper about czar and the notion of coordination. Of course, that has been something that scholars have looked at. They've said policy czars are necessary because jurisdiction of key policy arenas is split up across so many parts of the bureaucracy that you need somebody central to manage that. These councils could, at least in principle, be organizational manifestations of these czars. You suggest or not, don't ignore that possibility. But again, I'd just like to be a little more convinced of that. So on Annie's paper, these are in the order that I happen to have them in my notes in front of me. Here, I think, again, we have an interesting attempt to look at the trade-off between politicization and centralization. And here, with this sort of overlay of regulatory review, we're within a sort of a world where people have written about how presidents have sought to, again, make sure that what's happening in the agencies when it comes to regulation, and of course remember that power to promulgate regulations is normally vested in agencies, not in the president. And so there has to be sort of a back-end way of checking on what the president, what the agencies are doing. I think it's a pretty neat empirical test. It's something that I know Dave Lewis and I wrote a APSA paper about a million years ago and never published. So I'm very glad that you're coming back to try to see about this question of substitution. Just a couple things to note. One would be that there have been efforts by presidents over time to make sure that the person in the agency overseeing the regulatory agenda is a political appointee. And sometimes that's been made, actually as far back as the Carter administration, there was an effort to do that. Then again, certainly under George W. Bush, again under President Trump. And so, those executive orders by Bush and Trump were rescinded by Obama and Biden, respectively. And I don't know if you would see any variation, as your data move forward, perhaps. In sort of a regime where the political appointee has at least supposed to have control over the regulatory agenda, and in worlds where that's not necessarily mandated. I do have kind of a sequence question. I mean, if you're looking at agency year, do we know, which is the chicken and the egg in terms of the OIRA review and the appointee? Did the appointee get there first? Did the rule get there first? You may not be able to get that fine-tuned, and I'm not sure I would really push you to, but it's just sort of an interesting question to make sure that the effect that you find is following the cause. I did have a question about final rules and wondering whether you would expect to see more changes in proposed rules. That's an empirical question. I don't actually know the answer to that. But you could think of a world where final rules have already been changed at the proposed rule stage, and so you'd see more intervention, and perhaps Graham can weigh in on that in a second. So I didn't know if it was useful or possible to move to the proposed rule data here, or if that would show you anything different. And then last, this question, this was a conversation I was having with Scott earlier, actually. There have been heroic efforts to try to quantify how distant presidents are ideologically from agencies over time. And these efforts really have been impressive, and yet, you kind of wonder about them. Often they will either have lots of changes, right? They'll veer back and forth, depending on how you measure it, or it's a constant forever, and that doesn't seem right either. And we don't necessarily have a great measure of presidential ideology either. So so we end up saying, okay, all Democrats are the same, all Republicans are the same. Again, nothing you can do much about, I think, in this project, but you might want to wave your hand at that, if only to note, that Dave Lewis and others should go back and do better work on this. He's got to provide us with some data. On Scott and Lee's paper, as you saw, this is at this point sort of a really interested, descriptive data dump in a certain way, and really neat to see, something I really hadn't pondered much, sort of the mix of general officers and other SES, career and otherwise, over in DOD. It did remind me a little bit of, we think of the Pentagon certainly as following a very clear chain of command. In fact, Neustadt, to come back to him, when he talks about how Eisenhower will hate being president because he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. It's not at all like the Army. Right? Well, maybe it is kind of like the Army, or at least the Department of Defense. James Q. Wilson, by the way, when he's categorizing the defense establishment as a bureaucracy, has it in two different categories depending on whether you're talking about an army at war or an army at peace. And I don't know if that's a distinction worth making in the way that you track your chain of command, but it did strike me as interesting. So again, we come back to this question of centralization, which you talked about as being centralization in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, see, the interesting thing is if I were doing my data on, say, executive order formulation, I would say all of that is decentralized, right? Because it's all out there in Virginia, right? It's not happening in the White House, but you're absolutely correct, right, to point out that is a more centralized site. And so it's a useful reminder of the variance even within the executive branch. And of course, our coding can only be so exact and nuanced, but a lot more is going on. Some of our studies are able to get at. Again, I think centralization may be the right word there, but you'll have to distinguish it, again, from the way that word is used in the literature. I did wonder whether that trend that you show, which is that a lot of the political appointees have moved away from the service branches and into OSD, has implications for civil military relations more broadly. You don't really draw normative conclusions yet in this paper, but I think that's of interest to see if indeed you have sort of a relative insulation in the service branches from the presidency as a result. You have less understanding of, even a divorce from the service branches. And is that a problem? And it occurred to me somebody like Carrie Lee, who's at the U.S. Army War College, might be an interesting person to collaborate with on that side of the question, because she works so closely in civil military relations. Other questions, but we'll save those. And Nathan, again, is coming back now to centralization rather than politicization, but the question of, I guess, whether the public knows that something is centralized or not, right? So the motive of the president's actions here. So if we think that they are going to centralize because they are responding to a public problem, right? Again, if we're using centralization as simply moving the locus of policymaking into the White House rather than having it out in, say, the Department of Commerce, then, oh. I just have a comment. Oh, okay, you're first. You're on the first. Well, the question there is, right, if that's what we mean by centralization, then why would the president get more credit for it, right? Doing it that way. Presumably the item is still part of the president's program, right? It's still a presidential proposal. The fact that it was drafted, in a different part of Washington, D.C. might matter to the public, but you need, I think, to show how. Right? Why does that get them more? Now, one answer could be that, well, they can do it better and faster and it will be closer to presidential preferences, and so actually it's not so much that they're getting more credit for it, but it's something they think they need to do, and therefore it's going to happen, in a centralized manner. And you do show, right, consistent with other findings, that presidential priorities do tend to be more centralized on average. I did wonder about the correlation of sort of State of the Union priorities as they're measured here with public priorities. One would think that those would match up somewhat, at least, that what made it into the State of the Union would reflect these most important problems that the public sees. And still am a little curious about how doorstep issues, right, are treated differently. Again, because I'm assuming that the issues that are not doorstep issues are still being listed by the public as very important, right? Those are the ones that make it into your data. And so why are they different? Is it something about inflation that's magical versus a different kind of policy? And you begin to get at that, but I think I'd like a little more explication. But again, I think the broadest question, and one reason, my own work, as you kindly noted, has worked mostly on managerial issues, and I tended to sort of test for but not find a lot of sort of political context in the centralization decision. I think in part is because it's not usually, that decision is prior to how that decision is going to be publicized, right? What's actually going to be, sent out. And so why would the formulation decision matter for public consumption? I'm not saying it couldn't. In a weird way, it would fit better, if in fact they brought it into one of Kenny's councils, but actually this was a really effective council, and you could take all kinds of, and it was doing the kind of policymaking you work. So in the Lawandi world, this might actually be a negative strategy, right? It could actually be harmful. So anyway, I will leave it there for the moment. I've got more to talk about. The nice thing about being back in in-person conferences is that we can do it over beer. So, Administrator Graham.